fast, where truth moves faster than a Holstein calf. No waiting on some pretty page. We're charting new ground in the digital age. From genomic codes to roll-out facts, we cut through the noise, no holding back. Not your daddy's dairy news tonight. We're sparking debates with every insight. The ring's not where the real fight's at. It's in the data, in the channel chat. From pasture to processor to your morning cup, we're raising the stakes. Try and get ahead of herd. Yeah! Where the future's more than just a word. Ahead of herd. Come on! The bullvine's calling, let your voice be heard.
Welcome to the Bullvine Podcast, where we tackle the tough questions shaping the dairy industry today. I'm your host, and this is the show that brings you bold insights, expert analysis, and the conversations that matter most to dairy professionals across North America. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most contentious topics in our industry, the fundamental divide between Canadian supply management and the American free market approach to dairy. While you were celebrating Memorial Day or Victoria Day this past weekend, two completely different dairy philosophies were operating just miles apart across the 49th parallel. We're talking about systems so fundamentally opposed that they might as well be from different planets. One built on the idea that farmers deserve predictable profits through quota systems costing up to $50,000 per cow. The other betting everything on market forces so volatile that the average dairy farm had negative income in nearly every year of the past decade. The question isn't which system is better, it's which one will survive the disruption that neither sees coming. From trade wars and quota disputes to the rise of plant-based alternatives and precision fermentation. Both systems face challenges that could make their current debates irrelevant. So buckle up, because today's discussion will challenge everything you think you know about what makes dairy farming successful. This is analysis that cuts through the politics and gets to the real economics affecting your operation, whether you're milking 50 cows in Quebec or 5,000 in California.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We've got some really interesting material in front of us today, stuff that gets right to the heart of things for you in the dairy world.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're taking a close look, a real deep dive into the fundamental differences between the North American dairy systems. It can be pretty baffling sometimes.
It really can.
Our main source today is this sharp excerpt called North American Dairy Systems, Flaws and Future. And it pulls no punches, looking across the 49th parallel.
No, it really doesn't spare anyone. It lays out this stark comparison, highlights the brilliant part, sure, but also some pretty significant, maybe even catastrophic flaws in both the Canadian supply management system and the American free market approach. Makes you question things you thought you knew.
Totally. And specifically for you, our listeners, knowledgeable dairy farmers, industry professionals.
Yeah.
Our job here is to unpack the surprising, maybe sometimes uncomfortable truths this source brings up. We want to pull out those key insights, the implications that actually matter for your farm, whichever side of the border you're on. Okay, let's get into it then. Let's unpack this.
So the starting point, the basic idea the source puts forward, is pretty straightforward, but wow, it's powerful. You've got these two nations right next door running what's basically a live experiment in farm ideology, specifically for dairy. Supply management here, free market there.
And the source is basically saying, look, after decades of pointing fingers back and forth, maybe not always productively.
Maybe not.
It's time for some brutal honesty about what each system actually delivers. And crucially, what the real costs are, not just the obvious ones.
And that leads us straight into, well, the elephant in the room, right?
Yep.
Or maybe the very, very expensive barn.
Exactly. The cost reality check. Let's talk quota in Canada.
Yeah, the numbers. There's something else. If you're not living it every day, it's hard to grasp.
The source points to early 2025 figures. Canadian dairy quota costs hitting somewhere between $35,500 and $37,500 per kilogram of butterfat per day.
Per day. And they even mention it creeping up towards, what was it, $58,000 per cow in some places? Alberta, I think.
Yeah, Alberta. So think about what that means. The source gives this example. A pretty modest 100-cow farm in Ontario could easily have quota assets tied up worth $3 to $5 million. And that's before you even think about Land, the barn, the actual cows, equipment, anything else.
Wow, that's just the price of admission, the right to produce milk.
Exactly. Now, let's flip that coin. Go south to the American side.
Yeah.
Zero quota cost up front.
Right.
You get the land, the capital. You can start milking cows.
Seems simpler.
On the surface, maybe. But the source describes this situation as operating in a market just defined by, well, extreme volatility, constant ups and downs.
And they back that up. There's this tough statistic. The average U.S. dairy farm had negative net income. Negative in all but 1 year for that whole decade leading up to 2019.
Think about that. Losing money most years on average.
Which brings us to the source's big provocative question. It sounds simple, but it really isn't, they ask. Which system is really more expensive? When you look at the long game, is it paying that, say, $50,000 up front for a pretty guaranteed right to make money in a stable system? Or is it rolling the dice year after year in a market where statistically you're likely to lose money more often than not?
It's not just about the upfront check you write, is it? It's the whole financial world you operate in.
Exactly. It forces you to look way beyond just the surface costs.
It was really interesting. Despite these hugely different economic setups, the source points out some areas where performance is, well, surprisingly similar.
Yeah, that's right. They look at per cow productivity.
Okay.
Canadian farms, the source says, get almost identical output per cow. They cite around 9,739 liters on average. Compare that to the U.S., which, when you convert it, is roughly 10,950 liters.
So not a massive gap like you might assume based on how different the systems feel.
Not at all. But alongside that similar production per animal, you see these huge structural differences.
Like what?
Well, Canadian farms, generally speaking, have dramatically lower overall capital needs because they don't need that sheer scale chasing tiny margins.
Right, less pressure to get enormous.
Which means, the source reports, minimal debt stress compared to a lot of those really large U.S. operations. And you see that reflected in ownership, too. 98% family-owned farms in Canada versus maybe 92% in the U.S. Still high, but a noticeable difference.
98% is very high.
It is. And the source uses this analogy I thought was pretty vivid.
Oh, yeah?
They describe Canadian farmers kind of like old-school breeders. Carefully perfecting their lines, slow and steady improvements in genetics, management within that stable system.
Okay, I can picture that.
Whereas U.S. farmers often are seen as chasing the absolute latest genomic trend, pushing for massive scale, hoping that getting bigger will somehow fix profitability issues.
That the need for scale might actually be creating.
Exactly. That's the irony the source points out. Chasing scale to solve problems that scale itself can sometimes cause.
That analogy really does paint a picture. And look, for you listening right now, running your farm, these differences, they're not just talking points for professors, right?
Not at all.
The source really hammers this home. This is strategic intelligence. It directly impacts the choices you make, expansion plans, risk management, day-to-day stuff.
Precisely. And it's not just data dumps. The source turns it around into questions you should be asking about your own operation.
Okay, like what?
Well, if you're a Canadian farmer, for instance, how does that big quota asset value stack up against your operational debt? Are you actually using the stability quota gives you, like leveraging it for long-term investments, sustainability stuff, energy efficiency, things that might be harder to fund otherwise?
Good question.
And have you really stress-tested your exit strategy? What happens if quota values, don't keep going up forever? What if they decline?
That's a tough one to think about. And for American farmers, what questions should they be asking?
The source prompts you to think, okay, how much of my farm's actual profit comes from the market versus government programs? Things like DMC, the Dairy Margin Coverage Program, or the baseline prices from federal milk marketing orders.
Right, disentangling that.
Are you really getting economies of scale? Or, and this is the provocative bit from the source, are you just spreading losses thinner over more cows? They bring up that 2015 analysis again, claiming 73% of U.S. farm returns came from government support. So the question for you is, what slice of your own income traces back to those programs?
These aren't comfortable questions, maybe.
Yeah.
But pretty essential for figuring out how resilient your business actually is within your system.
Absolutely. You need to know where the money is really coming from.
Which kind of leads us into what the source presents as maybe its most controversial point, this idea of an innovation paradox.
Ah, yes.
The claim, surprisingly, is that neither system, not Canada's stability, not the U.S.'s competition, is really optimized for driving truly revolutionary innovation in dairy farming itself.
It sounds wrong, doesn't it? You'd think competition or stability would fuel it. But the source builds a case.
How so? For Canada.
Well, for Canada, they argue the quota system itself, the limits on expansion, can act as a bit of a brake on certain innovations. Why pour massive money into, say, a breakthrough technology that dramatically boosts efficiency or output if you can't easily expand your herd to capitalize on it?
So the incentive for those huge leaps isn't quite there if your production is capped.
That's the argument. You might fine-tune, but maybe not chase the game changers quite as hard. They use an example like perfecting AI without rigorous performance testing, if you can't grow anyway.
Okay, and the U.S. side. How does that system hinder innovation, according to the source?
There, the argument is the relentless focus on scale and just surviving economically. Farmers are often trapped in this cycle, right? Pouring every last cent into feed to maximize immediate output per cow.
Means there's nothing left for other big investments.
Exactly. Maybe you have to skip crucial upgrades in advanced herd health monitoring or labor-saving robotics because you're just trying to manage cash flow month to month, making payroll, paying the feed bill. Survival trumps transformation.
So where is the big innovation happening then, according to this source?
They point overseas, places like New Zealand, Denmark, the Netherlands, countries that seem to blend market signals with some strategic long-term support. They mention successful breeding programs that really balance production with health and longevity traits, not just chasing one number.
Interesting. They mentioned the U.S. Dairy Business Innovation Act too, right? With its funding boost.
They do, but they frame it as sort of reactive, like, okay, our system isn't generating enough innovation organically, so let's create a program to try and force it.
Oh, treating the symptom, not the cause.
That's the implication. The source suggests both countries are so busy managing the problems within their systems, defending supply management, or navigating free market chaos that they've stopped asking if the systems themselves are the root problem for innovation.
And they put it bluntly, don't they?
Yeah. The question is, when was the last time you heard about a truly revolutionary dairy farming innovation coming out of Canada or the US? Are we just too busy defending our models?
That idea, defending the past instead of building the future, that's a powerful theme here.
Yeah.
And it connects to another reality check the source provides around milk quality.
Right. SCC. Somatic cell count. Key quality indicator.
They cite the U.S. National DHI average dairy herd information average at 181,000 cells per ml back in 2023.
Which is pretty good, objectively.
Definitely. But then they compare it to Canada's regulatory maximum SEC, which is way up at 400,000. And even looking at competitive provincial averages in Canada, like Alberta's 205,000, well, the U.S. national average is actually lower.
So what's the takeaway there? That U.S. milk is just better?
Not necessarily better across the board.
Oh.
The source's point is more nuanced. It's that a higher regulatory standard, like Canada's, doesn't automatically mean superior performance everywhere.
Oh, okay.
Thus, farms in both countries achieve excellent quality, often way below any standard or average. But the systems create different incentives. In the U.S., the market pressure is intense. Volume is key, so achieving high quality becomes a way for successful farms to differentiate and maybe capture premiums. In Canada, with more stability, the need to push quality far, far below the regulatory minimum might be less urgent for some operations. The drivers are different.
Got it. So standards don't equal performance. Incentives matter.
Exactly. And this fundamental incompatibility, these different incentives, they spill over into that ongoing friction we often see labeled as a trade war.
Yeah, the one the source says nobody's really winning.
Right. You see the headlines, U.S. dairy exports booming. And the source confirms at $8.2 billion in 2024, second highest ever. And Canada's importing more U.S. dairy too, a record $1.14 billion.
Sounds like trade is working then.
But here's the catch. According to the source, they look at the actual market access, specifically the fill rates for U.S. tariff rate quotas, the TRQs. That's the amount agreed upon that can come into Canada at lower tariffs. The average fill rate, a pretty dismal 26.72% for the calendar year allocations. So barely over a quarter of the agreed upon quota is actually being used.
Why, if the products are needed or wanted?
The source points to how Canada allocates those import quotas. They tend to give them overwhelmingly to domestic processors, existing players.
Who might prefer to use Canadian milk anyway.
Precisely. Rather than giving them to companies whose main business would be importing. So the negotiated access gets effectively neutered by the allocation method. The U.S. has even won dispute panels on this, lost one too. But the source says it's resulted in virtually zero real change in market penetration.
So it's not just trade rules, it's the systems fundamentally clashing.
That's the argument. Like the source says, you can't fix a vacuum leak on your milking system with diplomatic talks. The underlying mechanics are incompatible.
That brings us back to another point of contention, the cost to the consumer. The shell game, as the source calls it.
Yeah, on the surface, it looks simple. Yeah. Milk costs Canadians, about $4.81 a gallon? Americans pay around $3. Case closed, right? Canada's expensive.
But the source says, hold on, don't just look at the sticker price. It's like assuming the cheapest bag of feed is always the most economical choice for your cows. You got to look deeper.
And the deeper dive reveals
that critical data point. The 2015 analysis suggesting 73%, nearly 3/4 of total U.S. dairy farmer returns came from government support programs. That was estimated at $22.2 billion in subsidies that year.
Wow, 73%.
Compare that to Canada, the source points out. Farmers there get their income directly from the marketplace via regulated pricing, which includes their cost of production. There aren't those massive direct government price subsidies flowing in the same way.
So the source flips the script. The question becomes, who is really paying more for their milk?
Is it the Canadian consumer paying directly at the till? Or is it the American taxpayer, whether they drink milk or not, funding the system through federal programs like DMC or the price floors in the FMMOs?
And the answer is complicated.
Very. The source concludes it depends entirely on your situation, your tax bracket, how much milk you buy, and also what you value more as a society. Food security and farmer stability, or pure market efficiency.
They use another analogy there too, right?
Yeah, like choosing between investing in a super precise TMR feeding system versus managing pastures. One has high upfront costs and controls. The other is variable, maybe cheaper sometimes, different risks. No single right answer for everyone.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. The source flags an uncomfortable reality facing both systems right now. A shared crisis.
The generational transfer issue? Yeah, this is a big one.
The source is pretty blunt. They say both systems are, in a way, aging out of existence.
Oof, how so?
Well, for Canada, it comes back to those quota values. While they're great equity for existing farmers, they create what the source calls insurmountable barriers for young people trying to get in without inheriting the farm or having access to millions in capital.
Starting from scratch is almost impossible financially.
That's the picture painted. And for the U.S., what's the barrier there?
Market volatility. The source argues that the constant risk, the high chance of those negative income years we talked about, makes dairy farming an impossible business plan for many young entrants. Unless you inherit significant assets or have an unusually high tolerance for financial risk, maybe even an irrational one.
So it's not that young people don't want to work hard.
No, the source is clear on that. It's not about willingness to work. It's that the entry points are structurally broken in different ways. Canada, financially impossible for many. U.S., economically irrational without a huge safety net.
And while both systems are wrestling with these internal problems, succession, costs, innovation, the source throws a curveball. They say the really big disruption is coming from outside.
Yeah, this is the part that should probably keep people up at night.
They argue that both systems are kind of navel-gazing, debating internal rules, while a tidal wave is building offshore.
And they list the specific threats, things that bypass the traditional cow model entirely.
Like what?
Okay, first, plant-based alternatives. Already grabbing significant consumer trial 20-30% in some surveys. People are trying them.
We see that on the shelves.
Then precision fermentation. This is the tech that can create identical dairy proteins whey, casein in a lab using microbes, no cows needed.
Wow. Identical proteins.
And looking further out, but developing fast, cellular agriculture, actually producing real milk from cell cultures in a bioreactor.
And the source points out the money flowing into these alternatives, right?
Absolutely dwarfs traditional dairy R&D budgets. Investment is pouring into alt proteins.
So what's the impact of all this, according to the source?
The critical point is, these new technologies don't care about supply management quotas. They don't need huge land bases for economies of scale like traditional dairy. They operate on totally different principles. Meaning, the source argues they render both the Canadian and the U.S. systems equally obsolete, trying to defend either system against this kind of fundamental technological shift. It's like trying to protect the jobs of people milking by hand when the milking machine was invented. The game itself is changing.
That really reframes the whole debate, doesn't it? Protect this system or that system.
Yeah.
What if both are facing the same existential threat?
Exactly, but the source doesn't just leave you hanging there in despair. They offer a way forward, a strategic framework, things successful farms should focus on no matter which system they're stuck in or operating within.
Okay, what's the framework?
3 main areas. First, focus like a laser on what you can control.
The fundamentals.
Yep. Milk quality parameters, consistency, cow comfort, longevity metrics, driving operational efficiency everywhere, feed, labor, energy, resource optimization. Nail these basics. They're universal.
Makes sense. What's second?
Diversify your risk strategically. And this looks different depending on where you are. For Canadian farmers, maybe it's leveraging that quota stability. Use it to make those long-term investments. We talked about sustainability, maybe even some on-farm processing. Things that are harder to finance when income swings wildly.
Okay. And for U.S. farmers?
Develop multiple revenue streams. Don't be solely reliant on that volatile commodity milk check. Maybe it's custom work, niche products, agritourism, renewables. Get creative. And for both systems, invest in tech that reduces your dependence on labor because that's only getting tougher and more expensive.
Got it. Control the controllables, diversify risk. What's the third leg?
Build adaptive capacity. This means keeping your finger on the pulse. Monitor consumer trends. What do people want regarding health? Sustainability, convenience, don't ignore it.
Be market aware.
And build relationships with your processor. Explore opportunities for differentiated products, not just lowest cost commodity. And critically, invest in data systems. You need good information to make fast, smart decisions when things inevitably change.
What's really interesting is the source observes that the most successful farms, the ones really thriving in both Canada and the U.S., they're already doing this stuff.
Yeah, implicitly or explicitly, they share these traits. It's fascinating.
What are those shared traits?
Intense focus on the fundamentals they control. Quality, cow comfort, efficiency. They find ways to diversify or manage risk within their system's constraints, using quota stability in Canada, finding other income in the U.S. They invest in their people. Big one. Skilled, motivated teams run farms, not just systems.
People are key.
And maybe the biggest trait, they adapt constantly. They're always looking, learning, adjusting.
It goes back to that neighbor's grass idea, doesn't it?
Right.
It's not greener because the system's magic.
Yeah.
The successful farms are just using smarter management, tailored to their reality.
Exactly. And the source's big conclusion about the path forward is this. The future belongs to farms that learn from the best of both worlds.
How do you mean?
Combining that long-term thinking and stability that quota can provide with the relentless focus on efficiency and innovation that competition can drive, it's like breeding.
Right.
You want proven reliability, but you also need cutting-edge genetics for progress. You need both.
But the source is really clear. The answer isn't for Canada to become the U.S. or the U.S. to adopt supply management.
Absolutely not. They stress that point hard. Solving either system's problems isn't about copying the other guy. The solution is forward, not sideways.
The real story, then, isn't the decades-old SM versus free market debate?
No. The real story, according to the source, is how everyone individual farms, entire systems, adapts when the fundamental rules change. Like when new tech comes along and potentially makes the old way obsolete. That's the test.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive, pulling from the source material, it's given us a huge amount to process, some pretty challenging ideas.
It really has. And the source doesn't let you off the hook easily. It ends by posing some final, really critical questions directly to you, the listener. Questions about your farm's future.
Yeah, they cut right to the core. For you, the Canadian farmer, they ask, in this world of improving affordable plant-based options, how long can you realistically ask consumers to pay significantly more at the checkout to subsidize farmer stability?
Tough question. And for you, the American farmer, how sustainable truly is a system that seems to rely on negative average farm income most years, requires billions in taxpayer support, and pushes relentless consolidation just to function?
And maybe the biggest question, hitting both sides of the border, how does either of your current systems really adapt or even survive when the basic premise that dairy products fundamentally require dairy cows starts to become technologically optional?
What's your farm's actual concrete strategy for navigating this post-traditional dairy world that's clearly starting to take shape?
Because the source is emphatic. It doesn't matter if you milk 50 cows or 5,000. Thinking about that future, planning for it, that's the most important conversation you should be having right now.
Look, this industry has shown incredible resilience before, right? We went from hand milking to robots, local markets to global trade, eyeballing bulls to genomic deep dives. Change happens.
True.
But that past survival doesn't guarantee future survival for every single farm. Things change.
And the final word from the source is pretty clear on who wins.
Yeah. The farms that thrive won't be the ones clinging to and defending the past. They'll be the ones actively building the future, investing in adaptation.
Regardless of which side of that border they happen to be on.
That's the challenge and the opportunity.
A powerful place to leave it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
That wraps up today's deep dive into the Great Dairy Divide between Canada and the United States. If this analysis challenged your thinking about dairy systems, and it should have, then we've done our job. The reality is, both systems are facing disruption that makes their current philosophical differences pale in comparison to what's coming. Whether you're operating under supply management or free market conditions, the farms that thrive will be those that stop defending the past and start building the future. Want to continue this conversation? Head over to www.thebullvine.com, where you can read the full article, access additional resources, and join the discussion with dairy professionals from across North America. You'll find detailed analysis, industry insights, and the kind of forward-thinking content that keeps you ahead of the curve. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bullvine podcast wherever you get your shows. And if today's episode got you thinking, share it with someone in your operation who needs to hear this perspective. Remember, the dairy industry has survived transitions from hand milking to robotics, from local sales to global markets, from visual breeding to genomic precision. But survival isn't guaranteed for every operation. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? This has been the Bullvine Podcast. I'm your host, and until next time, keep questioning, keep innovating, and keep building the future of dairy. Thanks for listening.